Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.
And hello again, everyone, and thanks for being with us. It was a history-making primary election. Ours, Arkansas Republicans nominating their first woman gubernatorial nominee, Democrats nominating the first African-American of either party to be their standard bearer. At the federal level, meantime, it was business as usual, or very close to it, and much of the attention on Tuesday night was a bit down ballot, the constitutional offices and the state House and Senate. We're going to recap in the next 30 minutes and try to look ahead to November. We are joined, as we were on primary night, by Jay Barth, emeritus professor of political science at Hendrix College, and Robert Coon, a partner at the political consulting firm Impact Management. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us. We'll begin tonight with a couple of seconds from both major party headquarters. It was an even, certainly on the Republican side, the evening belonged to Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
You know, being a first-time candidate, I've experienced a lot of different things.
No problem.
I've come to events like this pretty much my entire life, but this is the first time I've ever stood on the stage as the candidate. And I gotta say, I don't hate it. It is such an incredible journey that we have been on for the last year and a half. And the people in this room are the ones that got us here. And it is beyond overwhelming.
And not terribly far away in terms of physical distance anyway, the Democratic nominee, it was quickly resolved on primary night, would be one Chris Jones.
The path forward is engaging every voter. The path forward is having conversations with people across the state in all 75 counties. The path forward is the Walk a Mile in Your Shoes tour that we're going to start. And we're going to ask voters to take a chance on us. And we're going to ask voters to listen to our message of spreading PB&J across the state, preschool broadband and jobs. And we believe that that message will get us there.
And that message is about to be tested over the next, 5 months anyway. Gents, is it fair to say, I think it is, that Robert Coon, that it's Ms. Sanders to lose?
For sure. I mean, I think if you just look at the turnout that we saw on election night, it was overwhelmingly Republican. Republican voters actually outpaced the 2020 Republican turnout, which was a presidential year. Typically, those are higher. Made up 78% of the vote. So clearly the intensity, the excitement was on the Republican side. I think Sarah Huckabee Sanders had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, Jay, is there a path forward for the Democratic nominee?
It's a very challenging situation. I mean, but you know, obviously dramatic upsets happen in politics. I think what is, you know, particularly troubling for Chris Jones in this race is that not only are the atmospherics blowing in a direction that is contrary to Democrats, not just in Arkansas but nationally, right, but in addition, you know, you've got this enormous money and real popularity on the other side. So it's a lot to get through. He's a very talented candidate, but it's a very challenging situation for him.
Well, yeah, both, as they demonstrated on election, both are very polished candidates in their approach, but Ms. Sanders has, as Jay mentioned, Robert, she has an enormous financial advantage.
Tremendous financial advantage.
Record-setting, yeah, every report set a new record.
And raising it across the country. I mean, yeah. I think it's almost limitless in some ways. I think Chris Jones is, for an unknown, an unknown candidate from the beginning, has raised significant money, has had a high burn rate, had to get his name ID up. I mean, both have, are doing it well, but she clearly is well advantaged in that regard.
Also a good night for the incumbent Republican Senator, the Honorable John Boozman, who it was thought might be in something of a close race, but as it turns out, Jay, his margin was pretty substantial.
Yeah, it was very solid. He got well above 50%. It was never really a doubt that he was going to be the nominee without a runoff, and so I think a pretty impressive night for him. Now, he spent a whole lot of money to get there. He was, as our polling showed over the months ahead, he was not particularly beloved in the party or statewide, but he got there, and he is almost assuredly going to return for another 6-year term.
Yeah, along those lines, Robert Coon, what is it? Mr. Boozman has always run close to 50%. I mean, he's always gone over the majority, but what is it that works against him?
Well, he's not flashy. He is a determined member of the Senate. He does it. He gets up and does his job every day. He's
workhorse show horse.
Yeah, workhorse show horse. I think that summed it up well. I mean, he's just not seeking headlines. He's not on Fox News, OAN. You just don't see him throwing out partisan red meat. I think that kind of, that's a disadvantage to him in some regard, just because his profile isn't as high.
Well, it's certainly not his voting record when you look at that compared to the Republican orthodoxy, certainly in the Senate now.
Yeah, it's very consistent vote on all the big core issues, but it is, I think, it's about personality. It's about kind of energy. It's about rhetoric. It's those things that kind of work against him. I think it actually makes him a much more easier to work with member of the U.S. Senate. I think his colleagues like him enormously because he is truly an incredibly nice human being, and I think that works well for him in his day-to-day life. It doesn't work well for him every 6 years when he has to face the voters.
There seemed to be a real obvious synergy at work here in the gubernatorial, on the Republican side, gubernatorial race and Mr. Bozeman's race. The common denominator was Donald Trump. Well, and you could say Ms. Sanders as well.
Yeah, I mean, they both very much emphasized their ties to Donald Trump.
Yeah, was Donald Trump driving this campaign at the top?
I think, especially
or Trumpism, populism / Trumpism.
I would say Trumpism more than Donald Trump. I think in the early months of right when Sarah Huckabee Sanders announced and where Bozeman got his campaign going, I think it was Donald Trump himself that was still driving things. I think now it is maybe morphed just a little bit, and it's a little bit more Trumpism than Trump. You certainly saw opponents to both of these figures try to get even more Trumpy and kind of question whether they were true Republicans. I think it was not much of a question that in the eyes of voters are in reality that these are very consistent Republican voters. It will be very interesting as the year goes on, especially for Sarah Huckabee Sanders. To what degree does President Trump remain kind of front and center in her ads, or does she begin to really kind of move away and develop her own individual identity that is separate from her former boss?
That will, to some extent, though, depend on Mr. Trump himself, right, and where the country is in 3 or 4 months.
Well, I think Sarah Huckabee Sanders is already a star in her own right, especially in Arkansas. I mean, Donald Trump has universal name ID. Sarah Huckabee Sanders has universal name ID. Everyone knows who she is. I mean, that's half the battle. On Republicans, she's bulletproof virtually with the support. So, I mean, I think you've got the obvious connection to Trump, but I think she has her own brand that she's established, and I think that as you see that transition, it will be her brand.
Okay, and what will that brand look like? Got a clue?
Well, I think we've seen kind of sneak peeks of what it looks like from the political side and the campaign side. What we don't know is what it looks like from a governing side. I mean, and we won't know until she finishes the race in November and then takes office in January. At that point, we'll kind of know what her governing brand is.
Assuming, of course, she can outpace Mr. Jones.
Of course.
Yeah.
All right, Jay.
And I think on Tuesday, I mean, she showed some desire to be maybe a little more ambidextrous, a little more pragmatic. She certainly hit a couple of very hot button issues, especially abortion in her speech. But most of her speech was anything but hot button. It was very soft. It was very warm. It was actually very charming. And I think that is maybe signs of a governance that may be more like our father, which was, I think, much more pragmatic with a little ideology thrown in.
There was some, no small amount of interest in the Republican primary for lieutenant governor, in which we had a multitude of candidates, many of them well known, certainly within Republican circles, if not statewide. Would there be a runoff? No, there isn't. Robert?
I was quite impressed with Leslie Rutledge's performance in that race. I mean, in the polling that we saw, I mean, she was clearly leading the ballot. The question was she going to get over 50 and be able to hold it? She did, and she went into the home counties of all of these other candidates and won 50% in a lot of those counties. I mean, when you're doing that, I mean, that's obviously where those other candidates have to make up some ground, and she really kept them from doing so. So it was a great performance for her.
Incumbency can work against you, but obviously it didn't, Jay, in Ms. Rutledge's case.
No, not at all. And she's been omnipresent, right, on television screens, both through her advertising for her campaign, but also, of course, through the office, really highlighting her role as Attorney General, and and she was criticized for that by opponents, but she was always they were always shooting at her rather than, and it was clear she was the favorite from the moment she got in that race. It was already crowded field when she got in. She made it even more crowded, and I truly think it was, perhaps the most impressive thing of the night was how easily she won.
Right. One other constitutional office, or statewide constitutional office, or the judicial that I want to touch on, and that's Secretary of State. The incumbent, Mr. Thurston, was under challenge, Robert, and as were a number of secretaries of state across the country. Mr. Thurston prevailed pretty handily. He
did. I think that when we talked on election night, is Trump's brand transferable? I think that, Eddie Joe Williams had, as a Trump appointee, thought maybe he had the golden ticket in that race as wearing that Trump brand and having the photo. But, I think Donald Trump probably cared more about his last 18 holes than he did about the Secretary of State's race, and that just turned out in the numbers. I think incumbency was powerful. It's so hard to just put Donald Trump on you and convince people you're his guy. People know if he shows up for a rally, he's for you. Everybody's kind of got a picture with Trump these days. It just doesn't get you there, I don't think.
Well, unless he withdraws his support, which he did in a couple of races. Also on the statewide, we had 2 Supreme Court justices, Jay, on the positions on the ballot. Both incumbents. Justice Baker prevailed easily, but we have a runoff in Judge Wynn's position.
Yeah, Judge Robin Wynn got really close to 50%, but he couldn't quite get there at the end of the evening. And so he is going to face a runoff in November. It's going to be a totally different electorate. It's going to be a totally different game. And we may see, in fact, I think it's somewhat likely we will see some big money come in against him. Judge Chris Carnahan is going to be his opponent. Chris Carnahan has really strong Republican credentials. And we still, see in Justice Wynn one of the more moderate members of the court, and it would be, a further step away from the historic moderation of the state Supreme Court towards a more conservative court if Wynn were to lose. Yeah. On the other hand, Karen Baker dominated. She crushed on the other side without really running much of a campaign at all, but she had that powerful title of justice on the ballot. And she, as a woman, we've seen in recent elections, Arkansans have gotten very comfortable with women judges. In fact, they have some preference for them in terms of kind of probably some stereotyping about women and their judiciousness.
Yeah, and at every level of the judiciary,
yep.
Not just Supreme Court. But Robert, any surprises there on Justice Baker's sweeping?
Justice Baker's number was really very impressive, especially she filed late. Didn't really seem to have much of a campaign, going on in the public eye. I mean, I really think if you're running statewide against an incumbent without significant money behind you, it's just an insurmountable hill. Maybe there was some expectation of outside money coming in to help, but you can't run statewide in any of these races against an incumbent, or even maybe not against an incumbent, with shoe leather and burning up the highways. It's just not a path to success.
If you are Justice Wynn, what do you do for the next, 5 months? How do you approach that? Because in previous decades, judicial race, particularly the Supreme Court, has been driven from within the bar, and it's trickled out from there. Not so much anymore.
Yeah, that's going to be really tough. I mean, I think it's hard to raise money for Supreme Court races. Obviously, you can't ask directly. You have to have somebody kind of ask for you. That's a challenge in and of itself. I mean, I think his biggest opposition is likely to be against the outside spending that Jay referenced. And so if I were in his camp, I would be looking at my record, trying to figure out where are they going to attack me, be ready for those attacks, try to raise some money, but you're not going to outspend outside money. So it's really about kind of bracing for the attack and knowing what it's going to be and being ready to respond.
And Justice Courtney Hudson, did figure out a game plan for fighting off outside money and really trying to turn it on her opponent a couple cycles ago. I think we're likely to see a very similar thing from Justice Wynn if it shows up.
All 4 members of the congressional delegation were, 3 of the 4 were had primary opposition. And the 4th, Mr. Westerman will have, I think, a Libertarian in November. But they were all renominated easily, even though there were attempts to get to the right of them. Now, all 4 are pretty doctrinaire conservatives anyway. But there was an opponent nonetheless, Robert, on the right.
Yeah, this was not a change election. And so all of the incumbents, did well. You have seen a slight growth in the number of folks that are looking for an alternative against an incumbent. That was the Jan Morgan, Jake Beckett block, which is about 40%. That's grown steadily over time. That's roughly what Conrad Reynolds got in his race. It's just not a majority yet. I think that if you're an incumbent, you're still holding on. I think the mood of the electorate really matters. In this case, Sarah Huckabee Sanders was driving people out, and it was not people that were looking for something different.
And in the case of the gentleman who sits for the 2nd District, a romp.
Yeah, I mean, his lines changed around him. That brings some challenges of its own, but, French Hill won handily there with the new lines, and no issues, really.
Yeah, but essentially, though, that is going to, I say in a romp, he won handily. The Republican nominee, the eventual Republican nominee in future elections, whether it is Mr. Hill or someone else, is going to have, we think, a pretty easy time of it if these district lines hold.
Right, and as the legislature made that district more Republican and more rightward leaning for general purposes, it's obviously going to become even more so trickling down to the primaries more conservative.
Yeah,
so
Pulaski was the only
right.
option, I mean, for the Democrats had in that
right.
district, and now it's been splintered.
Yeah.
We are going to have a noticeably different Arkansas Senate. We had 2 incumbent senators defeated outright, and 2 others are defeated for renomination. 2 others are in runoffs. Mr. Sample down around Hot Springs lost his seat, and Mr. Beckham down in South Arkansas around Columbia County lost his. And we've got 2 runoffs coming up. That involves Mr. Sturch up in Batesville, the incumbent, and also Mr. Ballinger up in Northwest Arkansas. So, Jay, 3 weeks of real competition.
Yeah, and I think the outcome of those runoffs does have some real implications about what the tenor and tone of life in the state senate is going to be, because you've got some big personalities, especially with Mr. Ballinger and Representative Payton as well, who's challenging Sturch. That could be that's not just there's an ideological battle there, but there's also a big personality battle as well. Interestingly, there wasn't a clear. These folks who are in trouble, these incumbents are in trouble. A couple of them are more moderate, a couple of them more conservative, and so it's interesting that there doesn't seem to be kind of this clear overarching pattern of all the moderates winning or all the conservatives winning. It seems to be much more localized issues, and I think in many of these cases geographical issues, because these are the first elections after redistricting. And some of these incumbents, they've not run in areas that they've been asked to run. And anytime when you're introducing yourself to voters, that's a challenging election.
Reapportionment, redistricting, yeah. Robert.
Yeah. I think Jay's right. Geography mattered a lot in some of these because the lines changed around these members. I think 2 of them in particular, Beckham and Ballinger, you had some outside groups playing in those. Conduit for Action was playing in those. The state chamber was playing in those. And so, those dynamics probably on the geographic are really what kind of started pulling those different directions. The other 2 were just, I think, really geographic. I think the James Sturch's district in particular, you saw the addition of Cleveland County or part of Cleveland County into that where John Payton's from. And that just kind of changes that's more of that independence versus the rest of it kind of dynamic. And that's going to play out in the runoff too.
Yeah, but it's in some instances though, and Jay was saying it's really not, but one of you said was not a wave election in terms of ideology at all. That was reflected across the country too. I mean, some hard right candidates fell. Right. To more moderates, and then in some cases the moderates.
Yeah, Georgia being the best example of more moderate, or at least, if not anti-Trump, at least Trump-queasy candidates running. But then, you see in Alabama, one of the 2 candidates in the U.S. Senate is very hard right, Mo Brooks, although I think he's going to have trouble in that runoff in Alabama. Yeah. So it was kind of a weird election night where a lot of personality issues and a lot of geography issues really kind of drove things more than any kind of big tidal waves in a certain direction.
You look at Georgia, we're going a little bit afield here, but you look at Georgia as well, where statewide voters kind of thumbed their nose at Mr. Trump.
Yeah, I think they did, and I think particularly here, the 2 general rule of thumb was incumbents did well, the more conservative candidates did well, but it wasn't universal, right? I mean, there were exceptions to both rules, but they both did well, and there was some times when an incumbent lost or, a more conservative candidate lost, but as a rule, I think that was kind of the advantage on election.
Yeah, and one of the things that kind of caught my eye, and I know several others too, is that we had a candidate in the Senate race in Northwest Arkansas who hailed from Harrison, from a Chamber of Commerce, literally a Chamber of Commerce candidate up in Harrison in Boone County, which was one of the larger venues in that, I think about a 5 or 6 county district there. And did not do as well, did not have the impact that it was thought that he might have, Robert Coon.
Yeah, I believe that's one of the big population centers in that district.
The biggest, I think, yeah.
It's hard to know exactly. I think fundraising might have been an issue there, but more than anything, I suspect it's, name ID was an issue. It probably was pretty good in that area, but maybe not in the rest of the district. But, being a first-time candidate, Brian King and Bob Ballinger and Keith Slade, they know how to run a campaign. They know what to do. They know where to go. They know the type of work it takes. I don't know that Bob Largent didn't do that, but it takes that kind of energy. It takes that kind of, on-the-ground activity in those races.
Yeah, and those were two of the best-known names in that area up there. A legendary feud that was political and personal as well. They just sucked the oxygen out of that district, I think.
Yeah, and I think I want to highlight what Robert said about first-time candidates. The first time, and I've run for office, and the first time you run, you make a lot of, you don't know what you're doing, really. I mean, even if you've been around politics a long time. And it's just having been through the game and put yourself out there before you get much better over time. And the mistakes you make the first time out, you don't make down the line.
Dale Bumpers lost his first political race.
A lot of people lost their first race.
Yeah, but as Jay, I'm wondering, if Speaker O'Neill might have been just a little bit right in that it's at least a little of it is still local.
It is. Yeah, no, I think it is. I think especially in this particular cycle, a lot of it's really local.
In primaries.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that once we get to the general, then it's more title type factors that really come into play.
Yeah, and here's one that got a lot of attention, and it was a local race, but it got a lot of statewide attention, and that is prosecuting attorney in Pulaski and Perry counties. You had, take it away, Jay. I mean, that was a race to watch. So some surprises there.
Yeah, so Will Jones, a longtime prosecutor, really running in many ways to replace I guess his former boss,
Larry
Jegley, who's been in office nearly 20 years.
Longer than that.
Over 20 years.
Yeah.
And so, Will Jones was very much the kind of continuation of that trend. And then you had an opponent who was not particularly well known, African-American woman, Alicia Walton. And she got in the race, and I think everybody expected it was going to be kind of a walk for Will Jones. And then comes about $300,000 of George Soros money into the campaign, really praising her stances on some issues and criticizing Jones. And then you see big money come in on the other side, and with some pretty hard-hitting ads against Lisa Walton, who's been a defense attorney. It really became a very raucous race in the last week. It was a late developing race, but it got very intense at the end. And at the end of the day, it was a very close win. The expected winner ultimately won. Will Jones is going to be the prosecutor.
5 or 6 points,
right?
I think.
But it was a very much closer race than anybody expected, and I think that's the race out of this whole cycle that may have some national implications, because we're going to see that same battle play out in prosecutors' races, I think, all over the country in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that reform momentum, Robert, are you picking it up? You seen it?
Yeah, I think that's what really kind of gave her a boost was, kind of a reform approach to the prosecuting attorney's office rather than the traditional law and order, lock people up behind bars approach. Ultimately, I live in Pulaski County. What I was seeing in that race really was Will Jones probably had just a little bit broader appeal. So, I mean, he had kind of the law and order more right of center crowd, but he also had people that I would see on social media that were not in that, they're not in that community, and they were for him. And so I just think he had a little bit, enough of a leg in the other bucket to be able to pull what ended up being the margin of victory out of that race.
But I do think that there's a large swath of voters who just know something isn't working when it comes to the criminal justice system. You know, this decades-long approach is just simply not resulting in the success that we would expect out of a rehabilitative system.
If I have the numbers right, and this is off my shoulder, I think we are now spending the Department of Correction and Community Corrections. It is now north of it's zeroing in on $650 million a year. That's a lot of computers in classrooms that aren't being purchased. Indeed. Jay Barth and Robert Coon, thanks very much for being with us. We'll see you a little bit later in the year, we hope. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.